An atheist professor publicly mocked Jesus Christ, but one student's calm response left the entire classroom stunned. The lecture hall at Stanford University hummed with low conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. Rows of students sat in anticipation, some eager to debate, others simply there for the required credit at the front of the room. Professor Daniel Warren adjusted his blazer and leaned against the wooden podium, his lips curling into a smirk as he scanned the class. Warren was infamous on campus. He wasn't just a philosophy professor, he was a performer. Every lecture felt like a courtroom drama, and his favorite subject, religion, more specifically dismantling it. His students had seen it before. Some wide-eyed believer walking into his trap, struggling to defend their faith while he tore them apart with cold, precise logic. He thrived on it. Today, the discussion had taken its usual turn, the topic on the syllabus, the fallacy of faith, why religion persists in an age of reason. Warren paced, gesturing dramatically. "We live in the 21st century," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "We have science, medicine, space, travel. Yet millions of people still believe in a cosmic father figure who watches their every move." A few students chuckled, others nodded, a handful stared down at their desks, avoiding eye contact. But the real question, Warren continued, pausing for effect, is why bad things happen. If this so-called loving God exists, he turned his sharp gaze, landing on someone near the back. Barron. The class quieted. Barron wasn't the type to stand out tall, but lean. He usually kept to himself, rarely speaking unless called upon. Unlike the others who crumbled under Warren's scrutiny, Barron never looked nervous. His dark eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. Warren grinned. He enjoyed a challenge. "Tell me, Barron," he said, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. "You're a believer, aren't you?" The class stirred. A few students glanced at each other, already anticipating what was coming next. Barron didn't move, didn't even blink. "I am." The professor's grin widened. "Fascinating. Maybe you can help me understand something. If Jesus is real, why do bad things happen? Why hasn't he proven himself?" The room tensed. Warren folded his arms, confident in his trap. He had asked variations of this question 100 times before, and the responses always played out the same way. Stuttering, circular reasoning, desperate appeals to faith. The class was watching, waiting. Barron, however, didn't react the way they expected. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't fumble for a verse or quote scripture. He just sat there, his gaze locked onto Warren's, completely unshaken. But something in the air had shifted, though no one could quite place why. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. A few students shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Professor Warren arched an eyebrow. Intrigued, he had seen students freeze up before scrambling for an answer they didn't have. But Barron didn't seem flustered. He just sat there, composed, like he was waiting for something. Warren broke the silence first. "No answer," he said, tapping his fingers against the podium. "That's what I thought." A few chuckles rippled through the room, not from everyone, but enough. Barron finally moved. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I never said I didn't have an answer," he said, his voice. "Even I just don't think you're asking the right question." Warren's smile faltered for half a second, so quick most wouldn't have noticed. He recovered fast, tilting his head. "Oh, enlighten me." Barron didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, he took a slow breath and said, "You keep asking why God lets bad things happen. But let's be real. What you're really asking is, why doesn't he stop them? Why doesn't he step in, take control, fix the world for us?" Warren clapped his hands together. "Exactly. Now we're getting somewhere." He pointed at Barron. "Let's say I'm on a train track and a train is coming right at me. You see me. You have the power to stop it, but you don't. What does that make you? Barron tilted his head. Are you saying we're all tied to train tracks? More laughter. Warren smirked, but Barron kept going. You're using a loaded scenario. Barron said if you see someone about to get hit by a train, stopping them is the clear moral choice because they're powerless to stop it themselves. But life isn't that simple, is it? People have free will. If God intervened in everything, we wouldn't have free will. We'd be puppets. Warren chuckled, shaking his head. Ah, free will. The classic escape route. A few students laughed, but others seemed to hesitate. Let's follow that logic. Warren said, pacing again. So if a child gets sick and dies, is that just free will? If a man loses his wife in an accident, should he just shrug and say, oh, well, God didn't want to interfere? Barron exhaled like he was expecting that argument. That's not what I said. You're mixing up human choices with suffering. Some things happen because of people's decisions, violence, injustice, greed, other things, like illness or accidents remind us that life is fragile. Warren pounced. Exactly, fragile, random, chaotic, just like the universe. No divine plan, just chance. Barron shook his head. No. Just because life has suffering doesn't mean it has no meaning. The class was quieter now. Even the students who had laughed earlier were listening more carefully. Barron continued, you keep asking why God doesn't stop bad things. But let's flip the question. Why does anything good happen at all? Why do people love? Why do they forgive? Why do they sacrifice for others? If the world is just chaos, why do we fight for something better? The professor opened his mouth to respond, but paused for the first time in one of Warren's debates. It wasn't just the believer on the defensive, but Warren wasn't ready to let go of control just yet. Warren crossed his arms, his usual smirk still lingering, but something about Barron's answer had unsettled him. The class sensed it too. The usual rhythm of these debates. Warren setting the trap, the student stumbling, and the professor delivering the final blow, wasn't playing out as expected. The professor leaned forward, his tone sharpening. You're dodging the point. Barron, you're talking about love and sacrifice as if they prove anything, but those things don't need a god. Humans are social creatures. We evolved to care about each other for survival. Altruism is just a biological function. Barron studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's test that idea. Let's say you're right. Everything we feel. Love, kindness, selflessness. It's just chemicals in our brains, something evolution wired into us. So what happens when someone decides to ignore that wiring? When they choose to be selfish? When they hurt others? Just because they can? Warren's smirk returned. Then we call them immoral. But why? Barron asked if everything is just random chance. If there's no higher meaning, what makes one action right and another wrong? If morality is just something we invented, then a person who kills for fun is no different from a person who feeds the hungry. They're both just following their instincts, right? A few students frowned. Their gaze is flickering between Barron and Warren. This wasn't the direction they were expecting. Warren scoffed. That's a false comparison. Societies create morality because it benefits the group. We punish murder because it destabilizes the community. Barron tilted his head. So morality is just whatever works for the majority. Warren shrugged more or less. Barron let the words hang in the air for a moment before he asked, then was slavery moral? When the majority supported it, the classroom went completely silent. Warren's expression hardened. That's not what I said. Barron didn't back down, but it's what your argument suggests. If morality is just decided by the majority, then slavery, segregation, and genocide were all right at some point in history. just because most people accepted them, is that what you believe. A few students shifted in their seats. Even those who weren't religious seemed uncomfortable with Warren's position. Now, the professor exhaled, shaking his head. You're twisting my words. Morality evolves as societies grow more enlightened. What was acceptable in the past isn't acceptable now, because we've progressed. Barron nodded slowly, and what makes that progression possible if right and wrong are just human-made ideas? Why do we instinctively feel that some things are wrong, no matter how many people accept them? Why do we look back at history and feel disgusted, even when those actions were normal? Back then, Warren opened his mouth, then shut it again. Barron's voice was calm, steady. We recognize evil, not because society tells us to, but because there's something in us that knows something deeper than culture or biology. That's why people have fought against injustice even when it costs them everything. That's why we see courage in those who stand up for what's right. Even when they're alone, the class was silent. Some students leaned forward, drawn in. Warren shifted his weight, trying to regain control. So what you're saying? Morality proves God exists. Barron exhaled almost like he felt sorry for him. I'm saying morality proves we aren't just animals. It proves we have a conscience that isn't dictated by society. And if that's true, then we have to ask, where did that conscience come from? Warren stared at him, his jaw tightening slightly. But before he could respond, one of the students in the front row spoke up, a voice from the front row, cut through the silence. I have a question. The class turned to look at the speaker. Jessica, a sharp-minded student known for being one of Warren's favorites. She had been nodding along to his arguments earlier, but now she seemed uncertain. Warren raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Jessica hesitated for a second, then looked at Barron. You said we recognize evil because there's something deeper in us. But what about all the suffering that isn't caused by people, natural disasters, diseases, accidents? If God is real, why doesn't he stop those? Some students nodded. It was the question, lingering in everyone's minds, the one Warren had been circling from the start. Barron met her gaze. That's fair. He let the moment settle before asking, Jessica, have you ever lost someone? She blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, she admitted after a pause. My grandfather last year. Barron nodded. And what did that loss do to you, Jessica? Frowned. What do you mean? I mean, did it change you? Barron's voice was gentle but firm. Did it make you see things differently? Did it make you cherish people more? Appreciate time more? Jessica didn't answer. Immediately she swallowed, then gave a small nod. I guess. Yeah, Barron leaned forward slightly. Suffering isn't meaningless just because we don't like it. Hard times change us. Pain forces us to see what matters. It teaches us to love better, to live better. If God stopped all suffering, we wouldn't learn those things. Warren let out a dry laugh. That's your argument that suffering is good for us? Barron shook his head. No, suffering is awful. Nobody wants it. But if we only judge God by whether he prevents pain, we're missing the bigger picture. Warren scoffed. And what bigger picture is that? Barron exhaled. Look at history. The people who changed the world the most weren't the ones who had easy lives. They were the ones who suffered, who lost something, who were pushed down, who had every reason to quit but didn't. Martin Luther King Jr. suffered. Harriet Tubman suffered. Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust. Corrie ten Boom lost her family in a concentration camp, but spent the rest of her life spreading forgiveness. These weren't people who lived pain-free lives, but their suffering led them to something greater. The room was dead silent now. Barron's voice remained steady. If God stopped every bad thing from happening, we'd never know courage, We'd never know sacrifice. We'd never understand love in its fullest form. Because real love is choosing to care, even when it hurts. Warren pressed his hands against the podium, gripping the edges. His voice was quieter now. So what we're just supposed to accept? Suffering Barron shook his head. No. We're supposed to fight against it, to bring good out of it, to be the hands and feet of the God we claim to believe in. That's the difference. Jessica swallowed hard. Other students were shifting in their seats, not in discomfort, but in something else, reflection. For the first time in one of Warren's famous debates, the momentum had shifted. The professor wasn't in control anymore, but there was still one thing left to be said. The tension in the room was thick, the usual laughter, the quick retorts, the smug grins. Warren's debates usually inspired. All of it was gone. The professor's confidence, so unshakable at the start, had dimmed just enough for everyone to notice. He let out a slow breath, then pushed away from the podium, pacing slightly. All right, Barron. Let's say I grant you that suffering can have meaning. That doesn't prove God exists. It just means people are resilient. Barron studied him for a moment before asking Professor, "Do you love anyone?" Warren frowned at the sudden shift. "What do you love anyone?" Barron repeated a family member, a friend, anyone. The professor hesitated. His students had never seen him truly personal before, and now all eyes were on him. He gave a small shrug. Sure, of course. Barron leaned forward. Prove it. Warren's head tilted slightly, and a few students in the back murmured. He let out a dry laugh. What prove that you love them? Barron said, his tone even. Show me love under a microscope. Put it in a test tube. Weigh it, measure it, define it using scientific data alone. Warren crossed his arms. That's ridiculous, is it? Barron asked. You just admitted love exists, but you can't prove it scientifically. You can't see it. You can't hold it. The only reason you know love is real is because you experience it. The class was still locked into every word. Barron continued. And that's exactly why I believe in God. I see him in the same way we see love, not through a microscope, but in the way it changes people. I see it in the mother who forgives the man who killed her son. I see it in the doctor who spends his life saving strangers. I see it in every person who chooses to do good even when they don't have to. Warren's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jessica blinked, looking down at her notebook, her pen frozen in her hand. A student near the back swallowed hard. Someone else shifted in their seat. Their arms crossed their eyes, distant in thought. The room felt different. Warren exhaled and let his hands drop to his sides. So that's your answer. His voice was quieter now. You believe because you see good in the world. Barron nodded. I believe because I see a reason to. A long silence followed for the first time. Warren didn't have a comeback, but before the class could dwell on the silence, the bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture. The sharp chime of the bell echoed through the lecture hall, but no one moved. Usually students were quick to pack up, eager to escape the classroom's grip, but this time they sat frozen, as if breaking the silence would shatter something unspoken in the air. Professor Warren glanced at the clock, then back at Barron. He cleared his throat. All right, class, he started, but his voice lacked its usual bite. That's all for today. Still. No one rushed out. A few students exchanged glances. Jessica hesitated before closing her notebook, her expression unreadable. Others were lost in thought, staring at their desks. Barron finally stood, gathering his books, as if nothing had happened. His expression was calm, unbothered. He didn't look like someone who had just shaken the foundation of a man, who built his career on challenging faith. Professor Warren watched him. He didn't stop him, didn't throw out one last retort. Instead, he simply said, I'll see you next class." It was subtle, but there was something different in his tone. Barron nodded. "See you then." Professor one by one. The students began to leave, some whispered among themselves, others walked in silence, their minds still turning over the debate they had just witnessed. Jessica lingered for a moment, her notebook still in hand. She looked at Warren, then at Barron's retreating figure, and then she left too. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Palo Alto. The campus was alive with movement, students chatting bikes, weaving through pathways, the usual rush of the evening. But Barron walked at his usual pace, his face unreadable. He had no illusions that he had won anything that wasn't the point. He knew people wouldn't walk away from that lecture instantly converted. He wasn't trying to force belief on anyone, but he also knew that something had changed. Maybe for just one student in that room, maybe even for Professor Warren himself. Faith wasn't about winning arguments. It wasn't about proving things under a microscope. It was about seeing the world differently. Barron knew he couldn't make anyone believe, but he could make them think. And sometimes that was enough. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.